So Seamus, take it away.
Sure.
Raphael.
So I'm Seamus Leahy, and I'm a front-end developer that likes to do interactive stuff. So what we're going to talk about tonight is about getting your feet wet with interactive SVG vector graphics. And we'll be using JavaScript, and to help facilitate the SVG creation, we'll be using this library called Raphael. And then we'll be tying a little bit of it into jQuery with events and whatnot. So before we go there, kind of a backstory. SVG has been around for about 13 years or so. It's a XML-based vector file, graphic file. So you can actually open it up in any text editor. It's all open standards, so anyone can use it. But most of that time, you've only been really able to do stuff with it with like Illustrator or Inkscape. And for a while, Adobe even had a plugin for your browser to view SVG files in your browser. The actual support in web browsers, even though they promised it for a long time, sucked. In fact, IE didn't have it at all. But with HTML5 coming into being, SVG is part of HTML5. So if you're a browser and you want to make nice and claim that you support more HTML5 than any of the other guys, you're going to have to put in SVG. And so the whole spec is actually now integrated fully into HTML5. So you may be wondering, well, HTML5, interactive graphics. I can already do interactive graphics with Canvas, so why not just use Canvas? And honestly, you can do everything in Canvas that you can do in SVG, but it's just going to take a lot more work because Canvas is a pixel by pixel control. So you have full control over your graphics. And it means you have to do all the work of drawing them. Whereas in SVG, it's very abstract from that. You don't have to worry about refreshes or painting this. You just kind of give it this abstract shape. You say, here's the points, here's how it's shaped. Draw it, and it just goes ahead, draws it. You can do animation. So the difference is Canvas gives you all the control, but makes you do a lot of work. SVG does a lot of work for you. And it's also part of the DOM. So each shape that you draw with SVG is actually an SVG element that lives in the DOM, which means you can do all the normal DOM activities with it. You can actually tie your normal events to them and use jQuery on them if you want to. So you can use SVG in the browser now, but you still need some help. So that's where Raphael comes in. What it does is it's kind of like, think of what jQuery does for the DOM, and that allows jQuery makes a lot cleaner API to find and insert elements than just doing the standard DOM calls. It also smooths over all those bumpy inconsistencies between browsers, and it adds features that maybe one browser doesn't have, or it does all this nice clean work for you. And that's what Raphael also does, except for SVG and vectors. So instead, it creates a nice clean API so you don't have to do all this DOM manipulation yourself of inserting stuff and shape generation. It also gives you a whole slew of helpers so that you don't have to do all this math yourself. And it smooths over the fact that IE8 and IE7 don't actually support SVG. They support instead a precursor to SVG called VML that they kind of created and try to get everyone to adopt, and no one adopted it.
Surprise.
Yeah. So that's enough of the history. So let's actually start drawing something with Raphael. But before you actually draw anything, you have to have a place to draw the stuff, kind of your canvas, your workspace. In SVG, that would actually be the SVG elements that the caps hold all the containers. In Raphael, they abstract that to this paper object. So here what I'm doing is I have a width of the height of it, and then the element that I want to put it inside of. And you just call Raphael, give it the element, the width, and the height, and boom, you have this paper object. This is kind of this global object that represents that you will use to then draw everything else on it. So starting with something really simple, a circle. Not very sexy, but you just call that paper object .circle, and you provide three things. You provide the center point, which is the x and the y for the center of the circle, and you also provide the radius, how big it should be. And that will give you the actual circle object as this little element. Now, if you want to style it, you don't want to just, by default, just be like drawn with a black outline. If you want to style it, you use the .attr attribute, and then you can modify all the attributes. And so most of what we're going to be doing here with styling is very similar to changing the CSS on an element. Let's say you're using the CSS method in jQuery. Now, some of the names are a little different. Instead of doing background color, you do fill. But you can use all the CSS colors. So you can use names. You can use the hashbang with the 3 or 6. You can even do the RGBA colors. So you have all those colors with you. Then stroke for the color, stroke width, number of pixels, and even some things that you extend over from CSS, such as the cursor. So if I move my mouse over it, I get the little weight. Rectangles aren't much different. Again, you call paper.rect, and then you pass in the attribute parameters, and it will give you back a rectangle object. So there's 4 that are required: the x and y for the top left corner, the width and the height for how big it should be, and then you have an optional one of radius, which actually will do a border radius, do a little rounded corner. All right, so basic shapes are great, but you actually want to draw something more complex. Let's say we want to draw a unicorn. How do you draw a unicorn? Well, I'll tell you how you do. First, you find an SVG file with a unicorn drawn on it. You open it up in your text editor, and it will look something like this. I stripped out some of the extra stuff, but this is kind of summed down. And you'll find this path object. And then you'll have this attribute D, and it'll have this long string. And this long string is kind of a series of numbers for points and locations and command characters. And this gives you a brief understanding, well, explanation, I guess, I don't even know, understanding of what those commands are. You think of it as commanding a pen drawing on paper. So you can say, put the pen here, move to here, or pick up the pen and move the pen elsewhere. So you can actually get shapes that are kind of separate, but all one continuous path. So there's a whole lot of things, and some of them are also for doing curves. Obviously, if you do a curve, you need the Bezier anchor points that extend out there to guide it. So here's the unicorn. So really, just copy that string that I took from the SVG file. I just put it in a variable s here, and I truncated it, obviously. And then I call paper.path, and then pass it that string. And now I have this path object, and you can style it like we did before. The thing to note, it will be, we haven't told it where to place it, so everything in that string is absolutely positioned. So if I say got the SVG file, and instead the unicorn was down here and I wanted to put it at the top, well, you could just, one really easy way is just open up a program like Illustrator, move it up there, and resave it as SVG. You can also move around in Raphael, but sometimes you just you don't want to do that extra work.
I noticed that fill, it looks a lot like CSS, but fill would be background color.
Yes, fill is the background color of it.
Well, why didn't they say background color? If they wanted to easy to remember.
I would say that comes from the fact that fill is already what you use in graphics.
Oh,
so
they inherit from the graphics side rather than...
Yeah, so it's kind of a mishmash. Obviously, they want to make sure that anyone who's coming from the graphics side is comfortable with the names of stuff. But then new features that don't exist in graphics programs like cursor, you don't have that in Illustrator. Obviously, they're going to pull those from the existing CSS.
Are both defined? Like both background color and fill?
No, if you do background color,
whichever one you wanted?
Yeah, if you do background color, you're not going to get anything.
Oh, okay. Just curious.
So now we can do transform it, and transforms. There's 3 that they support. There's actually a 4th one which they don't have for some reason. You can rotate it, so you can rotate the thing any way. So actually that shape element, so that path that was created from the Raphael paper, we just call rotate and then pass a number in terms of degrees. You have translate, which it means move. You pass the x and the y to move it. So this is actually moving it over 50 and down 100. And then you can do scale, and scale is a number. I'll just multiply it by that and shrink it. So that all said, let's actually make it kind of interesting and not just so static. So animate. So Raphael supports animations. And all you do is very similar to jQuery's animate method. So you call .animate. The first thing you pass into it is the attributes that you would like to animate to. And then you pass it the time in milliseconds. It also takes the 2 additional properties. You can do easing, so you can pass an easing function in. In fact, they have a whole way you can even do more advanced easings, similar to CSS animations, if you're familiar with those easings. And you can pass a callback that will be called once the animation completes.
Wait, you said it uses you can use the easing plugin for jQuery, is that what you're saying?
No, this is very similar to jQuery. You can translate those over, but they're not compatible.
Okay.
And what I'm not showing here too is there's also methods to link together animations. So if you want to move 2 elements independently of each other, but you want to keep their timing in sync, they have a method to purposely keep those in sync with each other. Here's a little bit more advanced one where we actually morph the unicorn into a chicken. And it also shows an alternate format for animate. So instead, we should start. So how do we turn it into the chicken, first of all? So we're actually putting a new shape on the canvas, on the paper, that is a chicken. So programmatically what's happening is there's 2 shapes. Now, it's happening in a way that you can't see it here because it's happening all so fast. But for a moment, there's both the unicorn shape and the chicken shape. And then what we're doing for the animation is we're saying, I want to animate the path for the unicorn to the path from the chicken. So we're actually doing where here it says temp.attr path. That's pulling this path object out. And so animate that. And then down here, we just remove the chicken because we don't actually want to show that temporary shape. This alternative syntax allows you to do multiple steps. It actually looks very similar to the CSS animations syntax. So you pass it kind of a percentage of where in that total animation it should step to.
So, does it actually move the chicken into the DOM, or does it just morph the unicorn into the chicken? And the unicorn is just...
What it ends up doing is it puts the chicken in the DOM. It puts the chicken in the DOM with the unicorn. But we're only doing that as a reference so that we can then get the information,
pull out the
path information, so and then we throw that away.
Does it easily pass in the path of the string and not create the chicken?
You could, well, it actually takes the path information, the string, and then changes it into this big array of information. So it kind of parses it.
Right, but would you need the 2 shapes, or could you just use 1 shape in the path?
You need the 2 shapes for it to reliably work because there's some translations going on. You might be able to get away with it, but that's the way everyone else has done it, so I've just followed it because if it works, why break it? So, okay, we can draw shapes, we can animate shapes, but to really make it interactive, we should have events where people can interact with it and clicks, and that's what events are. So Raphael does have his own event handling, his own event methods for click and all those things. But I kind of like to stick to jQuery for those because I'm familiar with it, and then I can also leverage other aspects of jQuery. So to use jQuery for it, what you do is you need the actual DOM element. So that object of the circle that I created, so I have a circle object. If you call it .node, it will give you the actual DOM element. Once you have the DOM element, you can use jQuery on it like any other DOM element. And so I'm wrapping in the jQuery object, I turn it into a jQuery object, and then I'm doing the event binding, a binding click, and then my little function. And actually what this will do is every time I click on it, it will keep moving it down 50 pixels until it hits the end and goes back up to the top. The great thing with SVG, since they're vector shapes, the hit area, for instance, on this one, is the actual circle. It's not a square. So if you ever needed something that was kind of these dynamic shapes with maybe several edges, like if the unicorn, for instance, we had that up there, it's not the box, it's the actual unicorn shape. All right, so Z index, I actually left this until now because it's a little tricky to wrap your mind around. How it works is, you know the CSS Z index attribute? Totally ignore that. That property has no bearing. The way Z index works is source order, the order in which you inserted them into the DOM. So if you actually looked at the source in like Web Inspector or Firebug and you saw the elements, the first one would be the very back, and the last one in the source order would be in the very front. So if you wanted to move something in front of another object, you would actually have to take it out and then reinsert it later on in the DOM. They have a little helper method to move stuff to the front, and the back you just call toFront. So for instance here, if I want to move the red one to the front, I do that and it just calls red toFront on the object. And what that ends up doing is it takes it out of the DOM and then reinserts it later on. And so every time I'm clicking these buttons, moving them around, it's actually reinserting them. But there's a problem with this. So in that case, let's say you bind events to them. So you have bound all these events to these shapes. And then you move their Z indexing. IE will forget all about what you told it to do. So this becomes problematic. So I actually had an example where it was the map of the United States. And each state had its own hit area, and when you roll over it, it would get bigger. And then you roll off of it, and it gets smaller. But to make sure that it didn't overlay over anything else, I'd move it to the front. Well, so in IE, what would happen is you roll over it, it gets big, moves to the front, and then it just stays big. The way I actually worked around this was actually creating invisible elements. So I basically duplicated all the states. So I had the ones you actually saw, and then I had the second set that was really in front. So I was actually inserting and moving stuff to behind these invisible shapes states. So I just set the opacity to 0. They were there, you could click on them, but you couldn't actually see them. And everything behind them shone through. And that way I didn't have to worry about losing the events in IE.
What if you were to try to delegate instead of bind? Do you still have the same issue?
You could do delegate.
You mean that would have fixed the problem, or?
Yeah, it would have fixed the problem.
Oh. Okay.
I like the other.
Hey, sometimes you got to. So you could also do, let's see. So there's some helpers for you. So we've drawn shapes, we've animated them, we've clicked with them. Now we need some actual helpers to really get some interesting things. So one of them is getting the bounding box. If you're familiar with imaging, like vectors and Illustrator, you're familiar with it. Otherwise, what it is, it creates the box that contains that shape. So if it's a square, it can be like a box that fully contains the thing. And for this, is a unicorn that fully contains it. So you call it get bounding box. And it gives you several pieces of information. For instance, it will give you the X and the Y for the top left corner, the X and the Y for the bottom right corner, give you the height and the width. And then what I'm just doing here is actually taking that box information, drawing a rectangle, and then using the glow feature in Raphael to give it this weird glowing effect. This is useful if you want to actually find where your object is on the page. So if you get bounding box, now I know where this thing is on the page. So if I want to move it somewhere, I know where to move it to. I'm not having to guess where it's at. You can also use it for other things, like you can determine then, like, is this box fully inside of another box, things like that. So you can kind of do all sorts of logic tied to this.
Can you do bindings to the box or anything like that?
No, it's just information. So that one, what I did was I drew a second box.
Gotcha.
You could bind to that one, but it's just kind of a mathematical concept for your ease of development.
Thanks.
This one I actually really like. So you can actually get information about the length and placement of paths, of curves. So here what I'm doing first of all is I'm actually getting the total length of that line. So if you actually trace along it and like measure it all the way there, I'm actually getting all that information, which it comes to be like 243 point something. But you can also get positions along that line. So if I say I want the position, the x and y, at 50 pixels along that, when I'm moving the thing, it will give me back the coordinates for it. So if you want to be able to map other shapes along a curve, you can. It also provides you back the slope. So if you want to do something kind of fancy with the slope, so let's say you want to like go up, you want to use the slope to define the shape or the size of something else, kind of very calculus-like. You can actually get that information and use it. No. You can also find out is a point inside of a shape. So for this one, for instance, I have a little dot, and it's right outside. And you can see that if we're just checking on the bounding box, that kind of box that contains it, it would be inside that box. But since it's actually outside of the shape, it's reporting back false. So if I actually move it, you now will see that it is telling me that it's inside the circle. So now you can use this to find if points are inside of shapes.
Are people making games with this? Because it seems like it would be really cool for making games.
I have seen a few games in it, but yeah, you could totally make games with it.
The hit detection without the bounding box is really powerful.
Uh-huh.
It's cool.
And exactly, I mean, the great thing, I'll get a little later, the great thing with Raphael is that it gives you kind of the full power of it at the lowest level, so you can put it together however you want.
Since there's so much dummy manipulation in here, is there a performance hit that comes with that?
I don't know. Possibly. I haven't measured any of that to determine it. I've seen some pretty fancy examples of some pretty complex things going on. So they have actually, if you go to the Raphael page, they have a whole slew of demos, and they all work pretty swell.
One of my coworkers has actually used this thing. He put like 2,000 points on it without a problem. They're all interacting great. It's cool.
Social tables is using SVG, and part of the advantage of SVG is that you're able to just use the transform attribute. You can give it 3D Excel. If you give it a 3D transform, an identity transform, it'll run it all on the GPU. So you can toss around a couple thousand points easily. Just tell the GPU, render it here, render it there, scale it like this. And it doesn't have to doesn't have to think about what it's drawing. You can just tell the graphics card, draw this 80,000 times. The graphics card's happy to do that for you.
Can I use Raphael on the phone?
Yeah, you should be able to. It's you can just you just install Raphael in there and you just start using it. And yeah, the great thing that you mentioned with the GPU is the fact that since SVG is all being done in the browser, by the browser, as browsers advance and put additional accelerations and whatnot, you'll have advantage of it. You don't have to worry about doing that yourself. It just will be there. Oops. All right, so going forward, what we've used this for at work, for instance, was one project where I talked about this map thing. So what we actually had was all in Flash before. And it was this kind of reusable component we used a lot. And it worked. You pass in an XML file and it would color code stuff and bind the click actions. But it was kind of cheesy. It also played this annoying sound when you rolled over the states. And the part that really bothered me from kind of a visual standpoint was that it bound itself in this whole like box. And you weren't really able to put it inside and have it interacting with other elements. It was kind of like this whole area that you just had to leave alone. With SVG, you can layer over those other elements. So for instance, you could have this whole like interactive map. You click on a state, and just your normal div pop-up could come up over top of that, and you can have all this information in there. You can hide it. You can interact with your Ajax, any of that stuff. So it just becomes very integrated into it. There are also other tools for SVG. A lot of other tools are kind of very domain specific, so they do just charting or these kind of data visualizations. And those are very cool. And I would recommend that if you're looking for something that's already solved by one of those, go ahead and use it. But if you really want to be able to start building your own custom things from the ground up and get in there fast without having to worry too much about stuff, Raphael is a good fit for that.
I'd like to say something about charting with SVG. When you use actual inline SVG with a browser that supports it, the text labels are between the tags, and therefore they're readable by screen readers for the blind.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the only graphic format where if you like to do bar charts or whatever, you can have it be accessible to blind people.
And you can also put those accessibility elements, attributes on any of the shapes. So you could put title on it, you can put alt on it, you can put those roles on it, all that also on it.
While you're on the topic of like charting and stuff,
Mhm.
I agree that there's the Raphael library. Can you talk a little bit about that? And like when I went there, I had to like search really hard to find any kind of documentation. Like it was like on their GitHub page or something, but it wasn't linked to.
Yeah, I'd actually probably say stay away from the Raphael.
Yeah, I ended up using another thing that I found called
Like-
Graphico.
Yeah, there's a whole slew of them, and I know like at work we've been playing around with it's called D3 for stuff. So if for charting or data visualizations like that type, there's a whole slew. You could probably, I bet someone has an article out there which lists like 20 of them for you to play with. So Raphael is really kind of a nice way to bring SVG into your websites, make them more interactive. It's also great because it takes care of some of those pain points. It doesn't do everything that SVG does because it does have to kind of keep some level of support across all the browsers. I think kind of going forward, well, hopefully we can stop worrying so much about some of the older browsers and really fully leverage them. And I don't know if that means we will have Raphael as the library to do that or it will be something else. But if you start with it now, you'll have a good grasp of the core concepts for it. Does anyone have any questions?
So the cross-browser support, so Raphael only supports things that are HTML across the board. So I just find it hard to believe that all the browsers support SVG the same way in HTML5.
There are a few discrepancies, but for the most part it does. And like I said, it does support VML for IE 7 and 8. Now it is a limited scope for what they can do. So if there is a new feature that probably came out in the last several months, in say Chrome particularly or Firefox, don't expect to be able to use them in Raphael straight up. Now that being said, I've played around with actually inserting those custom things directly into the DOM. So like adding special styles that would just be read by some of the newer browsers and not by some of the older browsers. Adding in elements that will allow us to do like special fills. So what will end up happening is kind of this progressive enhancement where if you're in a newer browser, you get like this nice gradient that is from the top to the bottom across all these different shapes that are shared. Whereas if you're in like browsers that don't support that, you just would get like a solid color.
Is there a VRML support native, or does it use something like XCanvas?
No.
No,
No, it's VML.
I thought it was virtual reality. That's what we use for Canvas. When I do stuff in Canvas, I use a library called XCanvas that exports it to VRML.
Yeah, no, this isn't for virtual reality. It's basically a different variant of SVG. That was just Microsoft only.
Okay, but IE does support.
Yeah.
Yeah, so can you put it on the body element and do the actual layout in it?
Excuse me?
Can you do like the actual layout for the website?
You could, I suppose. I would say probably avoid. It might be a great thing to play with. Test it out.
You can embed things with a foreign object tag, so you can like compose your scene in SVG, animate it in SVG, and then have HTML elements inside of it. Or you could just build your entire website in SVG too, if you're really just that awesome.
Yeah, and that's
no reason why not.
That's a really cool feature of SVG. Unfortunately, Raphael, because of its like low level having support so many, doesn't have that feature built in. So if you wanted to just like not worry about some of the older ones, you could insert that in yourself.
does SVG and or Raphael support filling with images?
Yes. Yes.
Have you played around with Tim Woods or any other jQuery plugins that you can use with jQuery and you use it with Raphael?
Are you asking like have I used other jQuery plugins in combination with Raphael?
Yeah, I mean.
Oh yeah, yeah. In fact, that map, for instance, I actually wrapped that inside a jQuery plugin, so that for all our developers, it just like they didn't even think about the Raphael part. They just used jQuery and called the thing and created it all for themselves and had all these normal events like jQuery and all this stuff. But yeah, you could use because it's all DOM elements. You could use anything that could manipulate it properly.
Is your map on GitHub?
Yes, it is on GitHub. See.
Okay.
I actually have that. So if you go to @Seamus Leahy, it should be there.
Oh, awesome.
Where do you get at Raphael?
Raphael.js.org. Any more questions?
Google.com. Any more questions?
I was just going to say there's an article in .NET Magazine, the newest one about Raphael. I haven't read it yet, but I'm definitely check it out.
All right, great. Thank you, Seamus.
You're welcome.
All right, that about wraps it up. Thanks for coming. Feel free to hang out. We're here.